to have with us Dr. Konstantinos Trimmis, all the way from the UK. And thank you, Konstantinos, for accepting to give a presentation this early in the morning for you. The topic of his talk is of special interest to the AAIA. As recipients of our first ever European Union grant, we are embarking on an exciting collaboration with several European and UK institutions, and Kostas, as principal investigator and director of this endeavor, will be presenting on this project today. So a few words about Kostas. In addition to his charismatic qualities and young enthusiasm and optimism in everything archaeological and heritage related, Kostas' achievements as an early career scholar are quite impressive. Kostas received his BA in Archaeology and History of Art at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and his MA on Aegean and Balkan prehistory, studying GIS and Neolithic caves at the same university. As a postgraduate scholar, he attended the University of Sheffield and completed his PhD in archaeology at Cardiff University in Wales, specializing on archaeological mapping techniques in subterranean environments. Kostas has also had extensive experience in commercial archaeology, working in Greece, Croatia, and the UK before joining the University of Bristol as archaeology technician and senior research and teaching associate. At Bristol, he teaches archaeological practice, post-excavation analysis, and the archaeology of modern and contemporary Britain. Kostas's research focuses mainly on the application of landscape archaeology methods for the study of human societies past and present. He is interested in the prehistory of Southeast Europe from the Neolithic to the end of the Bronze Age, the study of the world diasporas, and the contemporary archaeology of Britain and Greece. He is also a collaborator of the Australian Paliochora-Kythera Archaeological Survey, working on the prehistoric landscapes of Northern Kythera, and he's also a visiting researcher at the Akrotiri excavations in Santorini. He is the co-principal investigator and project director of the Finds Stories project that aims to study through a combination of bioanthropology, material culture studies, and landscape archaeology, the impact of mobility in short-term migratory groups in the Balkans, which is what he will be talking to us today. The title of his talk, Find Stories, Can Creative Biographies Write an Inclusive History of the Balkans? Kostas will be taking questions at the end of his talk, so I ask you to use the chat option on your screens to put in your questions. And welcome, Costa, and I'm turning over to you now.
Thank you very much, Lita, for the introduction, and thanks the AAIA that invited me today to actually start this online lectures on in this new world we all live in. I really want to be in Greece now and giving the lecture in Athens, but I'm confined in my little study in Cardiff, which I'm like, it's almost a year now in this room. Anyway, it's really nice seeing you all even virtually. Now, as Lita said, let me share my screen. Stop, sir. Just give me a second. Let me share my screen. Here we are. Now, hopefully you all can see my presentation. As Lita said, this Find Stories project, to an extent, is right at the edge of my expertise, and is a really daring new venture for most of us, because I say to the people that I'm a Southeast European prehistorian and archaeological practice specialist, but these days we are delving in more and more into heritage. So Find Stories, we are in the very early days of the project. We started at the end of February technically, but in reality we haven't even started doing any research yet, mainly due to coronavirus restrictions. However, Find Stories is a collaboration of, as you can see in my screen, of several institutions from my home university in Bristol, Archaeological Museum in Zagreb, the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens, 2 schools in the International School of Belgrade and the Cateys High School in Cardiff, the YMCA Basketball Museum in Thessaloniki, and the Cardiff Metropolitan University. And as Lita said, all this is generously funded by the EU. The idea of Find Stories started in reality, not as Find Stories, but the idea of writing an inclusive, more inclusive history of the Balkans started when I was doing my PhD about like 8 years ago, when I was starting my PhD. And I was traveling into the Balkans mainly to record caves with Neolithic evidence and to test the mapping methodologies that Lita was saying I was undertaking as a PhD study. And what I realized is, so studying the Balkans, is that in reality, the Balkans, it's a series of changing borders between empires and great nations. And I have just a few maps from the last 150 years. Now I have to tell you that the borders, of course, were changing before the 1815, where my first map is, and they are keep changing after the 1945 with my map is. At some point, I would like to count how many times the borders are changed in the Balkans. And but what you can see is that always, if you see that maps, even from the beginning of the Neolithic period and down to the Bronze Age, classical antiquity, these are always maps that the colors are changing between great nations and big empires. You have the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and then you have the Ottoman Empire. And here in the maps that I'm showing you, you have the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then you got all the big nations. And these maps shows Balkan as a very colorful, tiled picture of different great nations, that they're embarking their journeys in history and they are confined back when their lifetime ends. But I started seeing things as I was crossing up and down the Balkans for my PhD, that they didn't fit that. I mean, what I was seeing on the ground didn't fit the geography of the region. And some things I couldn't. So let's say when I first went to Zagreb for my research, I saw quite a lovely Greek classical art in the Croatian museums. And this art hasn't been transported like the Elgin marbles from some colonial great power. They've just been found in Croatia. This lovely, wonderful Corinthian and Attic archaeology is actually been discovered in Croatia, and hasn't been discovered in Croatia because it's been traded there, but because Greeks actually went there, they built their own colonies and their own trade spots, and they make that art, Greek style art, in Croatia. Later, I've just realized with my Balkan friends, we're sharing quite a lot of common words and language characteristics, and we had quite a lot of, same cultural characteristics. As a friend of mine used to say, Balkan starts when people called grappa raki. And this is, and snaps, because, at the edge of the Hungarian-Croatian border is where that white spirit is been named raki instead of grappa or snaps. And other things in music, in food. So we're sharing quite a lot of common characteristics that to an extent makes a lot of sense, because we are all a big Ottoman Empire just a couple of 100 years ago. But also quite a lot of these characteristics can be explained by the migration of the Slavs and their mobility across the Balkans in the late antiquity. And my third map, which probably is a wrong map, but depicts that idea of people moving inside the Balkans and moving quite a lot, is this idea about the Caucasian what's the word, a biography of the Albanians. These are the map of an Albanian publication that's trying to explain how different national groups moved into the Balkan Peninsula and make the state that there is today. And even further to these kind of migrations, you have, just give me a second, sorry. You have this fantastic map, which is from the, just before the dissolution of Yugoslavia. It's a map that it's about the beginning of the 90s, that shows all the different ethnicities of the Balkans. And you can see the state borders, but the colors actually fleeing the borders and going into the other country. So you can see lots of Croats living right at the Dalmatian coastline. So this is modern day Croatia. Right here is Italy, down here is Greece, this is Hungary, Romania, etc. So you can see, as you probably know, quite a lot of Albanians living in Kosovo area, in modern day state of Kosovo, but also in the Tetovo area in the Republic of Northern Macedonia. So you see that the national, the people are not really correspond to the borders, or the borders are not really correspond to people. And even for areas that they are very, in this map appeared like unified, so look how nicely this, of course, this Greek Thrace has some kind of Muslim and Turkish-speaking population, so hence the different color. But look at this part of the map where Greece is solid red and looks very nicely and unified. If you look from a study from exactly the same period, so 1993, you will see that, sorry, my slides are jumping. You will see that even this corner of Greece, modern day areas of Kastoria and Florina, are actually very, very diverse linguistically, ethnically, and so you have the Pontic Greeks, you have some Turkish, you have the Vlachs, you have the Macedonski, as they used to call themselves, these groups of people that they still speak this kind of Macedonian language in the area. And there's a whole lot of story that this is not the case of this talk to discuss all the politics, because this is not a political science talk, that of course are shaping the Balkans. But what you see is that it's a history which is way more complex than these tiled nations of colorful, tiled maps of colorful nations would like to present. Now, another aspect that kind of so far we kind of overlook is that even if we set these borders on the map, even if we create that tiles of colorful tiles of nations, there's lots of migrations that they're taking and happening place in the Balkans every year. And this map, which is one of my favorite maps, it shows all the different migrations, short-term migration of the pastorals, the transhumans in the Balkans. And these routes, in some cases, are very much alive today. So you got transhumans in the Balkans that they are still taking their ships from the lowland to the uplands and backwards. And you have that cyclical, seasonal movement from lowland to upland. And there's not just the pastorals. you have the land workers. I mean, still in northern Greece, lots of land workers, agricultural workers. They are seasonally moving from Bulgaria or Albania or the Republic of Northern Macedonia to Greece and vice versa. And that's the case in Dalmatia as well. Quite a lot of land workers, agricultural workers, they are moving from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So you have this kind of seasonal movement, which is basically economic movement, but is way overlooked on how it shapes the area. And finally, we're living again in a period of a great migration, something that archaeology and history has recorded quite extensively in the course of the human presence in this planet. And this is, you see, the modern refugees and migrants from the Near East, that they're coming to Europe under political pressure. And sometimes in the news, these are presented as a linear movement. So refugees and migrants arriving in Greek islands, they're going through the Greek mainland, through the Balkans towards the Central Europe. But as you will see in this map from the UN, from the United Nations, you'll see that this is not a linear movement and is way more complex. And to an extent, these people actually shaping these countries again. So finally, and something that you will be all familiar with in this talk, you don't have only the intra-Balkan mobility, you have the inter-Balkan mobility. You have people from the Balkans doing the journey abroad for all sorts of reasons, and you have the creation of the big diasporas. And all Balkan countries have great diasporas across the world. I just put you two maps that I found on the internet. It's a map of representing the Greek and the Croat diaspora, but Albanians as well, and Northern Macedonians, and Bulgarians and Serbians have large diasporas across the world. So people did this kind of short-term mobility. They become mobile for a while in order to move from Greece or Croatia to Australia, to the USA, to the UK, as I did 10 years ago. So you have even a different level. And migrations in the Balkans are, and this short-term mobility, and I'm not talking in this talk, I'm not going to talk to you about long-term migration. I'm not going to talk to you about nomads, because we got nomads in the Balkans as the Romani people. I'm going to focus mainly on short-term migration that is either occasional, so people are moving from one place to another, stay for a bit, and then they're moving again, or seasonal, as the transhumans or the agricultural workers. So migration in the Balkans has been studied, and I would say it has been studied quite a lot, but mainly that migration focusing either on the big events, or whatever research has taken place in smaller scale is mainly, sorry, I need to jump a slide here because I put them upside down, is mainly these studies taking place using a kind of a traditional approach. That is doing quite a lot of historic and archival research. There's quite a lot of ethnographic observations. There's material culture study, of course, analysis of the past and present mobile groups. There's a typology analysis of the roots. And you have some minimal analytical science. I would like to point you to two papers that you can freely find available on the internet. One paper is from our very own Lita Georgopoulou Gregory, who hosts that talk. And I personally found this paper very, if I ever been asked, tell me the 10 papers that shaped you as a researcher, Lita's and Timothy's paper would be this best 10. It's a short paper which talks about household archaeology in Australia and Kythera, and examples of a two-way exchange. It's published in a book called Archaeology of Xenithia. Now this paper, what it tells is, it actually says that, Lita says, and of course, is going to be way more qualified than me to talk about her own research. But what Lita says is like, this is not enough. It's not enough to understand migration, diaspora, and mobility based on historical evidence, but we should actually study these kind of events more analytically, using analytical methods. And Timothy and Lita proposed contemporary archaeology methods and computational mapping, which is things that we are adopting in the Find Stories. So I think this is a very pioneering paper that's been published about a decade ago that saves the way. Another thing is Claudia Chang's paper, which I met her accidentally in London a couple of years ago. What Claudia did about 30 years ago in the beginning of the 90s, she actually went and excavate some of these archaeological sites, short-term micro-migration sites. So she excavated animal pens of the transhumans in the Balkans. And what Claudia said, and this is an extract from Claudia's papers, Claudia published 3 papers, all of them available on the internet, is that if we study as Lita, is pretty similar understanding on a different aspect of mobility, that archaeology and anthropology, but actually field understanding of these events can help us to understand these migrations better. And now I need to jump a slide before, because I'm talking so far about all these different migrations in the Balkans that sometimes history overlooks. And I'm telling you about Lita's and Claudia's work on how these should be studied more analytically and using archaeological methods. But why on earth we should need to study these migrations? Are they equally important, let's say, to the shaping of the borders between the national Greece and national Serbia? When I'm saying national, I mean Greece as a nation, and we are celebrating the 200 years of Greek Revolution, Greek War of Independence this year. And I have 4 answers why we should study this migration. Of course, because it's number 3 in my list of answers to that question. We need to understand these peculiarities that are happening and the certain characteristics of these areas in the world. And Balkans is one of these areas. For example, in the UK, they all speak about the 4 nations, but I haven't seen a lot of research how the Romani or the travelers or other nationalities that have migrated into the UK has actually shaped the UK in what it is today. And everybody talks about the Romans and the Normans and the Anglo-Saxon, but what's going on about these people that they are do you know that there is pastorals, there's transhumance in the UK? And I believe in Wales I live, there's transhumans that are taking the flocks from the lowlands to the uplands even today. And of course, that was a more wider practice about 100 or 150 years ago. So sometimes some characteristics of these nations and of groups of nations and areas and regions sometimes is easier to be studied if you look at these little elements that shape the regions as it is today. Of course, it's a methodological innovation of how we should study short-term mobility from this traditional perspective to a more Lita's or Claudia's perspective, when you can apply science to study this migration and not just history and ethnography and social anthropology. And of course, we would like to see the Balkans as a case study for methodological innovation, for policy-driven change, and to extrapolate this methodology to other areas in the world that they're facing similar characteristics. So even more complex example from the Balkans are the Indian subcontinent, where you have the colonial level as well, etc., etc. Now, big bold disclaimer here. You are about 5 years too early in this presentation. We are in the very, very early stages of this project. So up to here, that was quite, what I was telling to you was observations that they led us to the find stories. And I trying to describe the need of a project similar to the find stories. But from now on, where I'm going to talk to you about the actual project and its methodology and what we mean by that methodological innovation and what we mean about policy making driven research, they might well change because we are less than a month into that project, and I bravely answered to Lita's call for a presentation, but come back in 5 years' time to actually tell you where this journey led us. Now, leaving that disclaimer behind, the Find Stories project. So Find Stories is a collaborative project that is being funded by a mobility grant. So in reality, this grant pays the researchers to travel and meet and actually do research together. It's an Erasmus Plus grant. So Find Stories aims to write the narrative of the impact that inter and intra Balkan short-term migrations had and still has on both the migratory groups and to the region in general. In order to do this, we aim to analyze both the people that they're moving and the objects that they're moving. And we'll try to understand that way the short-term mobility. Now, following Lita's call for innovation on how you study migration in this household archaeology paper that please do read, is an excellent paper. We bringing in two notions that they haven't been used quite extensively in the study of these kind of mobilities. The notion of Anthroengineering, thanks to my colleague Christian Fernet for coming up with this idea, and I'll talk to you about the team in a second, and the idea of creative biographies, and thanks to my colleague of Konstantinos P who brought this notion forward. And I'll talk to you about Anthroengineering and creative biographies in a second. But before I do this, let me quickly present you the Find Stories core team. And now, excuse my colleagues from their photos. I actually scavenged their photos on a Sunday evening from the internet. So if anyone has a problem, I will accept their complaints afterwards. But what I would like, the reason that I'm showing you the Find Stories core team is that there is a truly interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary project that brings traditional archaeology with geomatics, bioanthropology, data science, heritage, and education. And you can quietly answer a question, why on earth you need a bioanthropologist and an archaeologist and an education consultant in order to write a creative and inclusive history of the Balkans and to examine short-term migration. But I hope that I'm going to answer this to you very quickly. Another reason that I show you the team is, please, since this is a truly multidisciplinary project, I may not be able to explain some things to you very well. And one of the things that I may not be the first thing that I'm not feeling 100% confident to explain it to you is the notion of Anthroengineering that we're bringing forward. Because this is to a big extent the realm of my wonderful co-investigator Christian Fernet from the University of Bristol, who does data science and biomechanics. Two worlds that they're far, far away from my galaxy. But anyway, Anthroengineering is an intersection between anthropology and engineering. It's where you bring engineering methods, and that can be mechanical engineering, software engineering, geophysical engineering, any sort of engineering into anthropology in order to help you in reality to study on a more scientific way the human present and past. And in Find Stories methodological perception, Anthroengineering, to its, it talks about bringing a geosophical approach to landscape archaeology research and using geophysics to identify these short-term mobility sites, but also using material analysis to study artifacts and the use of biomechanics to study the impact of mobility on individuals. When we're going into to study the objects, we are using two quite standard perceptions of material culture studies: the idea of the chain of operations, scène opératoire, when the functions of an object, the life circle of an object really has been identified and studied from its creation to use, reuse, and discard. And sometimes this chain of operations are not linear, but is very complex between the use, reuse, and disposal of an object. And we understand the objects in fine stories as that they have agency, they have their own life trajectory, and they build relationship with people and with other objects, is what Ian Hodder's current methodological idea of entanglement suggests. So the objects have complex biographies because it's been used by different people. They have been used in different settings. So bringing together biographies of people and objects that I told you would like to study in fine stories. When it comes down to people biographies, we aim to do osteoarchaeological analysis when we would like to record skeletal material from these mobile groups that we will study. Social anthropology, that is not included here, and this is my omission, sorry, my mistake, interviews and stories from alive individuals that they are members of these short-term groups. Isotopic analysis, biomechanical engineering, biomechanical analysis in order to study their bones and see how these mobility have impact their bones and their bodies. Looking onto the objects, we would like to do material culture analysis, artifact recording. We endeavor to record more than 500 objects that can tell stories about mobility. And of course, we would like to understand and record all the different life trajectories of these objects. Now, and some of these things have happened before. Other people went and record objects. And if you've ever been to Greece, I'm pretty sure you have gone to one of these laografika musea or ethnographic museums, laographic museums. So you will see these objects. This is objects. This is the material culture of a Greek pastoral in this picture. You will see the stick that they use. You will see the clothing, this heavy kind of overcoat. You will see the bells from the for the animals, but also, some objects to carry the milk here or to make the butter there. But what is usually doing is a researcher, an ethnographer, or a laographer, as we say in Greece, have recorded these, they put them in the museum, and then the community, it just goes and see them. So from this kind of passive recording that can be biased because it's the recording of one person, we would like to move to this, a collaborative, community-based biography of people and objects. We would like to give this data to the community and ask the community to tell us their stories. And this is a wonderful, this is not from our project, but I like it and I think it can be there because this is a wonderful kind of paint by a project collaborator, Maria Marino, who is one of the project artists. And I talk to you about this in a second. So we would like to collaborate in this project with researchers that they're simultaneously creative practitioners and professionals, artists. And we would like to merge the artists with the communities that we were about to go and record, these short-term mobile groups. And the reason that I would like to bring creative professionals and communities together is in order to produce what we would like to call creative biographies. So biographies of the objects and the people, that they're not just a bunch of data, abstract descriptions or abstract imaging, but something more interesting. And the need for these can be depicted in this picture. So one of these groups that we would like to study, and I'll show you our case studies in a second, is the Vlachs, the modern day transhumans of Samarina area in Greece. Now, very recently in Samarina, they've been refugees and migrants from the Near East. And you'll see a picture from Samarina where the refugees are arriving with all their kit. And on the top of the picture, you have an image of Vlachs that they actually is been fleeing southern Albania at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and they are moving into Samarina. What you can see, and I love this picture, is the only thing that really changes is the clothing of the people and the mean of transportation. But I love that how the mattresses really has the same patterns. So can these stories help to bring people together? Because from this kind of leaflet that Yorgos Konstantinou, a really talented comic artist, has done for the village, is that do really the refugees creating problems to a kind of a traveler's society like the Samarina is? So we try to change that perceptions using the objects and people biographies. If we tell people that you are very mobile themselves, they may start understanding mobility in a different way. And ultimately, we would like to find stories for social inclusion. We would like to use that stories that they will start as scientific recording and analysis, and they will be transformed into creative biographies. We would like to use these stories in order to feed policy making, in order to change, to foster social inclusion of the migratory groups in the Balkans, but also of other migratory groups across the world, because we would like to try our methods of social inclusion based on the heritage of the migratory groups in different contexts. One of the contexts that I would like to try is the context of Greeks in the UK. Now, very briefly about our case studies, where we would like to do this research and what is these groups they would like to study, because I'm talking to you about people's biographies and object biographies, but what people and which objects. First of all, we would like to record objects and people's stories from Greek-Australian exchanges at the island of Kythera, really to build on Lita's ideas that she had first expressed in her paper about 10 years ago. We would like to see the modern day Vlachs of Pindos, which are still transhumans and they're still practicing short-term mobility. Same for the migratory and sedentary groups of Thessaly, and we will try to compare the migratory with the sedentary groups and see if that groups have any difference, how the mobility impacts the mobile group in relationship to the sedentary group. The historic pastorals of Dalmatia, these are groups that they stopped practicing short-term mobility about 300 years ago. We would like to study the cave of Ratcha in the Lastovo Island, which has, it was always a center of mobile communities, that cave. And finally, migratory and sedentary groups from the late antiquity, from the Sisak and Beli Manastir areas in Croatia, which, similar to the case in Greece, you would like to compare the sedentary with the mobile group and see how mobility impacts them. Now, there are other groups in the Balkans, of course, that we overlook, like the Romani people. But first of all, these are mainly nomadic. They're not particularly short-term mobility. It's a different kind of mobility. And of course, we're not looking to the Central and Eastern Balkans. So in reality, with using that site not to rewrite a history of the Balkans, but actually to propose how we should study the Balkans and in any area of the world that these kind of mobilities and short-term migrations are happening. Now, very briefly, and when it comes down to people, we plan to use cinema verite, observational cinema, and interviews, in reality, to film these kind of activities. And we are collaborating with a very talented Greek filmmaker, Konstantinos P, who is an archaeologist and a researcher. And of course, for the study of the skeletal materials, I'm going to fly through these slides because please don't ask me about the biomechanics. I'm really cannot tell you the answers. But when it comes down to the skeletal materials of the historic population, so from the alive populations, we're going to film them and interview them, the Greek Australians, for example. But the people that they are not with us anymore, we are planning to study their skeletal assemblages. And we're planning to do traditional osteoarchaeological recording, the age, sex, and any pathological lesions that they can be recording in the bones. We plan to do isotopes, and you probably know that through the analytical methods of the isotopic analysis, we can study both mobility using strontium and diet. So we'd like to see these kind of mobilities, how they actually been recorded in the people's bones and how are their dietary characteristics. Further, we plan to do some biomechanical analysis based mainly on lower limb morphology on some individuals in order to record the impact of mobility on the skeletons and how they affect their skeletal assemblages. When it comes down to objects, we plan to do first-hand fieldwork in Racha Cave and Samarina area in Greece when we archaeology to report physics to you record any kind of these migratory artifacts firsthand, so not go just and find them in a museum, but actually get them off the ground. And again, as with the bones, some traditional recording, photographic documentation, drawing, a description of the object to understand the object's life trajectories, but also some quite state-of-the-art computational imaging using LiDAR cameras. And if you have the iPhone 12 Pro Max, you probably know how a LiDAR camera looks like, where you can do a 3D model just with your phone. But also structure for motion photogrammetry is what Hollywood is using in order to do 3D models, and reflectors transformation imaging. Now, we don't have to record every object using all of these techniques. Some objects, they might need this kind of level of computational imaging. Some other objects, a simple description in a photo may be more than enough. I'll skip the Vlachs of Samarina because I'm just right up to 40 minutes that Lita told me that I should talk to you. And what I'm showing you these pictures, I just realized I have 1 more minute. So why I'm showing you these pictures is when we actually, that's the only kind of output of the project so far. So you have to bear with me in order to see how these fantastic methodologies would be applied in these 6 case studies that I talked to you. And I would be grateful to invite you in our exhibition that hopefully COVID allows us to do it physically and virtually. There will be a virtual exhibition as well with all these wonderful people and object biographies that we will record. But our only preliminary work so far is that very small ethnographic study we did in the area of Samarina that we planned. It's one of the areas that we plan to do fieldwork. You have a Vlach pastoral community. The society is moving from the lowlands to the uplands the last 500 years at least, from the Thessalian plains to the high mountains. These are proper high mountains. There's almost 2,000 meters high mountains, and 6,000 feet, other 2,000 meters. So Vlachs from Samarina moving twice a year, so it's that short-term annual mobility. They're not nomadic, they're just living the permanent village in the Thessalian plains to move on to the permanent village on the highlands, the village of Samarina. And then they're coming back at the end of the season. And they're doing this movement with their flocks, with their animals. And what we would like to do is you will see a modern day pen and a historic pen. And you can see quite a lot of the objects. You will see the as I said, the traditional stick, the glitcha, as we call it in Greece, which you use in order to flock the animals. But you will see other kind of objects that they're part of the skevi, of the material culture of a pen. So what these stories can tell, what stories these objects can tell us, and what stories the community can tell us if we would go and try to do an object biography workshop with them. On the same perception, what these people, if we interview them, or if we study their ancestors' skeletal remains, what these people can tell us about their short-term mobility and how this short-term mobility has impacted the people, but also the region. And this is a representation really of a traditional pen. Now, that's some observations, very, very brief, but in reality, these roots, what we argue here is that roots seems to be changing a lot in the Balkans. People are using the same routes for short-term migration. It may be inter-Balkan migrations, the Greek diaspora in Australia or in the UK, and the Croats in the USA, and the Albanians in Argentina. They might be a quite modern, they might not be very modern, because think about the Greek migrations of the 7th and 8th centuries BC. So people used to travel off the Balkans even in the past, and diaspora, it's not a very modern trend. And with this image from an August panegyri, and how we all have missed panegyria with COVID, from Samarina, I'll tell you a very big thank you. This picture is fantastic because the people that actually are sitting on the benches and eating are transhumans. These are actually pastorals. They have moved up to the high mountains in order, they have done short-term mobility in order to move their flocks to the high mountains. And then in their summer village, Samarina, they have this panegyri. And guess what? The musicians are also a migratory group. They're musicians that they're moving from a village to another village. And they're even more mobile than the actual pastoral. So you could see two of these mobile groups that they are living and still surviving in the Balkans in this one very picture. Thank you very, very much for today. Lita, thank you very much for for inviting me. And we really hope we'll be back in a couple of years' time to actually tell you what kind of biographies we managed to record. Or we might tell you that this thing doesn't work at all.
Thank you so much, Konstantinos, for this wonderful presentation on a very, very exciting project.